idea for all this really came from a dream?
Yes, it did.
Good evening and welcome to Nox Mente. Tonight's guest is Robert Guffey. Robert is an author and lecturer in the Department of English at California State University at Long Beach. A graduate of the famed Clarion Writers Workshop in Seattle, he has also written a collection of novellas entitled Spies and Saucers, published in 2014. His first book of nonfiction, CRYPTOSCATOLOGY, Conspiracy Theory as Art Form, was published in 2012. He's written stories and articles for numerous magazines and anthologies, among them The Believer, Black Dandy, Catastrophia, the Chiron Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Mailer Review, Pearl, the Pedestal, Phantom Drift, Postscripts, and the Third Alternative. One of his latest books is CHAMELEO, A Strange But True Story of Invisible Spies, Heroin Addiction, and Homeland Security, which Flavorwire has called by many miles the weirdest and funniest book of 2015. His latest book is Bela Lugosi and the Monogram 9, which you can get at Amazon. Robert, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Robert.
I thank you for inviting me on.
It's our pleasure.
Yes, and it's a great pleasure. And before we actually get started in the show, I feel the need to just send our prayers and best wishes out to the family of Tracy Twyman, who has passed on. She was a member of the community, deeply respected and loved, hard-hitting, deep research, and it's just a big loss. And we found this out through Clyde Lewis's website just 20 minutes ago. So, sweet.
Tracy Twyman passed away?
Yes.
Yeah. Allegedly.
Here's what Clyde said. We are so saddened to report the sudden death of former Ground Zero producer, accomplished author, and friend Tracy Twyman. Details of her death are private, out of respect for the family. Tonight, we will represent the best of Ground Zero featuring Tracy in her honor. We love you, Tracy, and we pray for you and your family. Clyde Lewis, Ground Zero team. It's pretty terrible.
It's interesting. We were just talking about, right before we went on the air, about Paranoia Magazine and how I used to write for Paranoia Magazine. And I shared a table of contents page with Tracy Twyman many times.
Yeah, we were just talking to her last month about coming on the show. So
yeah, this is hard.
Really?
This is really a hard hit for our community. It's sad. She's just so influential, and I mean, who cannot respect the deep research that Tracy does on the subject matter she dives into? It's shocking. 41 is too young.
You just found this out just 20 minutes ago?
Yes.
Wow.
Clyde Lewis has posted it on his website. So there are no details, of course. It's who knows what's gone on, but she was only 41, and so, but I just wanted to send our prayers out and mention that because it is reverberating, and it kind of hit me really hard. And so I just wanted to get that out because she's now in the mind. And of course, Synchronicity has it that you were tied in with Tracy as well. So here we
Yes, it's kind of there's a line in David Lynch's Lost Highway where a character says there's no such thing as a bad coincidence, but of course we know that's not true. Synchronicity can be positive or negative, right? Just as right before you said that, I was looking across the room at my bookshelf, and on top, I realized the book that's sitting on top of my bookshelf, staring down at me, is a Donald Wandrei hardcover. Donald Wandrei was part of the Lovecraft Circle.
Yes.
And
yes.
the book is called Don't Dream.
Oh.
And those are the big bold letters in Gothic lettering staring at me at the moment.
Wow, this is going to be a night of chills right now. I've got like vibrating with them. Unbelievable. Yeah, these circles, So let's
small
get
circles.
into you, Robert. I'm going to focus in on you. So give us, what was the world like for you when you were little? What are your earliest memories, the things that kind of pop out? things that inspired you as far back as you can reach?
It's funny. One of the earliest memories, I put that in quotes, one of the earliest memories I have is in fact a dream, though I say that not definitively because I'm actually not entirely certain it was a dream, but it's as vivid to me as if it happened, so I assume it was a dream. But it was the green hand. It was a severed green hand with black and yellow cracked fingernails that emerged from the white linen closet in the hallway and grabbed me by the throat. And I can still vividly see the green hand, and that's all I remember about it. But it must have been a dream that I had very young, extremely young. But I was always afraid of the white linen closet because I thought that green hand was going to come out. So I'm assuming it was a dream, but
Wow. What are the features of the hand? Was it like an old, scary looking hand, or was it?
Yes, very. I'm not sure about old, but very sort of mottled and kind of like, these nasty black warts on them with the veins kind of bulging out of them,
Oh, yeah, very like old hag hand.
Frankenstein
yes, for
hands.
some reason in my mind, I think I think of it as a male hand with very long fingers, like very facile, like a magician's hand.
Yes.
But warty and green and cracked yellowish black fingernails.
Oh,
the
wow.
green hand.
How old do you think you were?
You know what? I in my mind, I'm thinking like 2 or maybe 3.
Yeah.
I know that Ray Bradbury claims that he remembers being in the womb. He had very vivid memories of being inside his mother's womb, and even said that he remembered being born. And that inspired a short story that he wrote called The Small Assassin, which I recently read actually to my daughter, who's 11. And I've been reading her Ray Bradbury short stories from a book called The October Country, which he published back in the 40s. And there's one of the stories in there is called The Small Assassin, and it's about a baby who does all of these sort of passive-aggressive strategic moves in order to kill his mother and father. The baby is actually sentient and murderous. And apparently Bradbury said that it was his vivid memories as a baby and in the womb that inspired that story, which is interesting because I saw Ray Bradbury speaking when I was 16 at Torrance High, which is where I went to high school, at Torrance High. And Bradbury would give a lecture there, unpaid. Normally he would get exorbitant fees from universities for giving lectures, but he would do this lecture for free once every year at Torrance High because that was the first place that ever asked him to speak. And so this would have been like 1987, maybe 1988. I saw Ray Bradbury speaking at Torrance High, and someone in the audience asked him, do you ever get any of your short stories from dreams? And I remember his response vividly. Bradbury said, no, dreams are that's just the junk that comes out of your brain at night. It's like, urinating or going to the bathroom. It's just the junk that's leaving your brain. I don't pay any attention to it.
Wow.
And I thought that was fascinating because it's the complete opposite of someone like William Burroughs.
Yes.
Who drew very heavily on his dreams, so much so that he wrote a whole book of just his dreams. My Education, which came out in the 90s at some point, which is a fantastic book. And in fact, my whole life, I've always been very fascinated by dream narratives, either nonfiction books about dreams or fiction that's somehow based around the concept of dreams, whether it's Carlos Castaneda and The Art of Dreaming, or the Don Juan books that he wrote, or Burroughs, H.P. Lovecraft, The Dream Quest of Anon Kadoth, and
Yes.
The Dreams in the Witch House, and the Call of Cthulhu. The whole plot of Call of Cthulhu is the fact that the main way that they know that Cthulhu is being called up is that all of these sensitive types around the world, artists and poets, all having the same dreams, or having shared dreams. So Call of Cthulhu is partly structured around the whole concept of dreams and shared dreams. There was a radio show, a radio drama that my older brother played for me when I was 12 or 13. And it was written by a guy named Thomas Lopez, who writes under the name Meatball Fulton. He writes radio dramas. He writes exclusively radio dramas. And he wrote a whole series of radio dramas about a character named Jack Flanders.
Oh, yes.
Who was like a dream investigator or a dream archaeologist, I guess you could say. And one was called Moon Over Morocco,
Yes.
Dreams of Rio.
Yes.
And the one that I heard first was called The Incredible Adventures of Jack Flanders. And this completely blew me away, because it was all about the guy Jack Flanders gets a crate in the mail, and he brings it into his house, and he opens it, and inside is a green velvet chair. And he doesn't know who sent it to him or why, but whenever he sits in the green velvet chair, he is transported to a dream world. And basically, it's a series of lucid dreams. He's dreaming lucidly, and also they're recurring dreams, because he'll be in some dangerous situation and then will wake up sitting in the chair, and then he'll think, well, that was weird, but then he'll have the curiosity of wanting to know what happened next. So he'll sit in the chair again, and the dream will pick up where he left off. And the dream world and the real world begin to meld, and fascinating. And this guy, I never hear anyone reference Meatball Fulton or Thomas Lopez, but these radio dramas are absolutely just brilliant and very funny examples of North American magic realism, I guess you could call it. Also, I discovered a book when I was 16 called Bones of the Moon by Jonathan Carroll, which is also all about dreams. It's about a woman living in New York who begins to have these recurring dreams where she's transported to another place. And she has a great first line. I love novels and stories that just have a fantastic first line that just kick you in the head. And the first line of the novel of Bones of the Moon is, "The axe boy lived downstairs." You have to keep reading that story. The story begins, "The axe boy lived downstairs." You have to find out who's axe boy. Who's this person talking to us? Why is he living downstairs? And so she begins to have these shared dreams with this axe boy character. And it's all about lucid dreaming. And I heard an interview with Jonathan Carroll, who's a brilliant writer. Bones of the Moon was his third novel, I think. And many of his books deal with dreams and similar phenomena. And Jonathan Carroll said he did not know, had never heard the phrase lucid dreaming when he wrote the book.
Oh, wow.
And later on, people came to him and said, "Oh, you must be into lucid dreaming." And he was like, "What's that?" That's sort of similar to the very first person who interviewed me about CHAMELEO, which is my book that came out in 2015, was Tessa Dick, the widow of Philip K. Dick. She has a radio show called Ancient of Days, and she had to be on talking about CHAMELEO, and she started talking about how much my book CHAMELEO overlapped with experiences that she and Phil Dick had in the 70s when living in Orange County, and which kind of blew my mind. I mean, she actually told me this book actually made some of these experiences make sense to me at last. You answered a lot of questions that me and Phil had back in the 70s by writing this book.
That's astounding.
It was astounding. And she told me a story that when Phil Dick wrote The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which was inspired by a nightmare that Phil Dick had of this black iron face in the sky, this giant black iron face staring down at him at the sky. from the sky that inspired the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And for years, Timothy Leary had said that was the preeminent LSD novel. That if you wanted to know, if you could translate into prose an LSD experience, then it was the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And one night, Phil Dick got a phone call from Timothy Leary and John Lennon, who were in a hotel room up in Canada. And at first, Phil Dick didn't believe it was either Tim Leary or John Lennon until John Lennon picked up a guitar and started playing a song and singing it through the phone. and John Lennon told him that he loved Ubik and he loved the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And they said it was amazing how he had clearly taken LSD and written this novel based on it. And Phil Dick told him, I had never taken LSD when I wrote that book. I mean, he'd never even been anywhere near it. Later on,
he was just a speed freak, right? He didn't even smoke weed or anything.
Yeah, Tessa Dick told me that she saw Phil Dick smoke a marijuana cigarette once in the entire time they were together. And she saw it and she was annoyed and slapped it out of his face for even smoking it. So the idea that he was just constantly chewing, just swallowing Pierce Sandoz LSD 24/7 is not at all true. In fact, she said he maybe took it 2 or 3 times his entire life. I think that's fascinating. These things that we associate with Phil Dick as being the premier psychedelic science fiction writer of the 60s and 70s, but much of that was just coming from him, from his brain.
Yes. That's
what I find.
Well, we can get to these states, we can pull it out, and clearly there are these amazing examples of people that just didn't touch anything, and in some ways were really prudish, and yet look at we look at bodies of work, and here we are.
Yeah, I remember in high school, we needed to do a oral report, and we could do it on any writer. It was a drama class, and the professor's name was Mr. Slater, and I wanted to do it on Robert Louis Stevenson and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but he said that wasn't literature. So I said, I went to my next choice, which was Edgar Allan Poe, and he said that would be fine. I'm not sure of the distinction, why one was okay and the other was not. So I did the presentation on Poe and the Telltale Heart, and at one point the professor stopped me during the oral report and said, "You should mention, one of the main things that made Poe's story so strange." And I said, "Well, what's that? I didn't know actually what he was referring to at all." And then finally he said, "Well, he smoked opium," and I thought, well, a lot of people smoked opium. It wasn't a rare experience at that time, but only one person wrote The Telltale Heart, and only one person wrote the Arthur Gordon Pym, and and William Wilson, and on and on and on. So these things don't work unless the proper receptor is there. If you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and also, back in the late 19th century and all that, there was, Coca-Cola's out there with real cocaine in it, and it was just the whole cultural aspect to some of these things that we now consider hard drugs was way different, and it was just a different experience. But this brilliant amount of work has come forth from that period, and then even moving back to the Romantic period, when who knows what was being taken, that was just not thought of as taboo. It was kind of a cultural norm for artistic circles.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. In fact, I actually remember having a conscious decision when the professor said that. I remember because I was 16. I just turned 16, maybe I was even 15 when I did this presentation. I remember thinking, I'm not going to mess around with any mind-altering drugs, because I don't want years later people to say, the reason his books were like that Because he ate a whole bunch of Sandoz pharmaceuticals, in high school. And so I actively, consciously decided to stay away from any kind of mind-altering drug, even though I had plenty of opportunities to do so in high school. People were shoving it at me.
Oh,
Here, try this,
Yes.
and it was just eventually understood that I wasn't interested,
Well,
and they moved on.
Some people just get there. We're just there. When you're back here in your earlier days, so you've given us a really great outline, and definitely these influences are exactly what I expect, knowing your body of work. Did you have a relationship with nature?
I just, what? Before I get to that, I just thought of something else, which was along those same lines. The fact that Lovecraft was very prudish, and didn't
Yes.
experiment with any mind-altering drugs either. And there's also Steve Ditko, who created Doctor Strange, the Marvel superhero, the Sorcerer Supreme, Doctor Strange. Steve Ditko's artwork was in the 1960s, super psychedelic. It was the one comic book that people, just normal comic book fans who were like 10 or 12 or 13 read, because it was this amazing superhero comic book. But people in the underground read it too, like Robert Crumheads also read Doctor Strange, because it seemed to be so LSD inspired. And everyone thought that Steve Ditko was a big acid head, that he had to be the biggest acid head on the planet. And so it was a big surprise to a lot of these underground artists, like Crumb, etc., when Steve Ditko later left Marvel and did a comic book called Mr. A and the Avenging World, where he came out as a very strident Ayn Rand, very objectivist, very, very politically right-wing, and very much prudish, someone who would never experiment with any sort of illicit substance. So it's interesting that these people are just they tapped into their own subconscious in such a way where they don't even, they never even needed any of that. And so it's just interesting that a lot of the times these people who have never touched any of these things are the ones who produce the strangest and most blatantly psychedelic works.
Well, Robert, what do you think that is? What, because this is something I've always observed too, and then also having done way back in the day a good deal of LSD and mushrooms, and finding myself in thinking. And back in the day too, there was not the internet when I was doing this stuff, so we would get into this stuff around local media or just ourselves, but it was generally art stuff, novels and washing fish in fish tanks, and graphic novels, strange art from the early periods like Bosch and Mucha and all this. What do you think that mechanism is that brought out such crazy imagery and symbols, yet that comes from people that could be considered prudish? Like, have you thought about that mechanism? Like, what is that? How did they naturally just tap into this that later becomes culturally associated with people with a psychedelic overlay on it?
It's interesting. I read Harlan Ellison, the science fiction writer who edited Dangerous Visions, which contains one of Phil Dick's most famous stories, Faith of Our Fathers, which is all about psychedelics and using psychedelics to control consciousness as opposed to liberating it to create a false reality.
Mm-hmm.
The Harlan Ellison, who wrote some very strange stories himself, he told some story. He was at a party with Theodore Sturgeon, like in the late 60s or something, and someone offered Harlan Ellison something to smoke, and Theodore Sturgeon had to say, "Oh no, this guy is totally straight." And they said, Theodore Sturgeon said, "This guy, he doesn't need. He's constantly tripping. 24/7 without it. He's already there, you know. Terence McKenna said something very interesting. He said, you know, there are those people who need to dissolve boundaries and those people who need to maintain boundaries, and that most people need to dissolve boundaries. They're so conditioned by so many things that they really need some sort of circuit breaker, as Timothy Leary said, some sort of circuit breaker to break the patterns and the conditioning. And for a lot of people, I think LSD serves that purpose, but other things can serve the purpose of being a circuit breaker as well. Timothy Leary, in a lecture I heard him deliver in 1993, Leary was talking about how the way that the medieval cathedrals were built were specifically structured to have an effect on the human brain that was consciousness altering, like an LSD trip. The stained glass windows, the bells ringing in a particular pattern at a particular time, the intoning of the ritualistic chants, and all of that were intended to take you into a whole nother place. Of course, it was in the service of organized religion, but nonetheless, the purpose of it was to be a kind of psychedelic experience, a medieval psychedelic experience. And other experiences can create that as well. When I went through the third degree of Freemasonry, it occurred to me after it was over that this too was an early version of a circuit breaker moment, and that everything that happens in the third degree of Freemasonry is specifically designed to alter your consciousness and to pull you out of yourself and your body and make you see things from a different perspective. I mean, most of what I'm about to say is not secret in any way. You can get any of this from your local library, but the basic core myth of Freemasonry is a death and resurrection myth, like so many other religions have death and resurrection myths, whether it's Jesus or Osiris or Odin, et cetera, et cetera. And so the core degree ritual, which is really a play that you're enacting, that you're actively participating in, is essentially a death and resurrection story, and you're the main character in that story. And so everything that happens to you, the way that you're led through the lodge, what's done to you during the ritual, what happens to you at the end of the ritual, all that is intended to pull you out of yourself and be as Timothy Leary said, a circuit breaker. And after I went through the third degree, I realized this was an early LSD experience. This was the third degree of Freemasonry was the closest you were going to get to an LSD experience. And
yes,
the purpose of it is to alter your consciousness. So people can alter their consciousness in many different ways, and you can do it through meditation, of course, obviously. But also, I think some people are just born naturally more attuned to that state. And Lovecraft was one of them, and Lovecraft had very vivid dreams, which he wrote about extensively. A lot of his stories were influenced by dreams. And I don't know about Steve Ditko, because Steve Ditko was such a private person, but and he recently died just last year. But I suspect that Ditko had a very vivid dream life. I would have loved to sit down with Steve Ditko. I would love to have heard Steve Ditko on this show. I would love to have heard about Steve Ditko's dreams. But by the way, in terms of the,
I've written to Alex Ross, if that's any consolation.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And what did he say? I
never heard back.
I'm looking forward to his response. I have an article coming out because I've had various stories and even nonfiction pieces that were inspired by dreams, and I have an article coming out in New Dawn magazine called Freemasons. New Dawn's fantastic. I've been writing for New Dawn off and on since about 2004, maybe 2005.
Yeah.
And
Yes, I know. I'm a subscriber. I pay.
I've had in fact, many of the chapters in my first book, CRYPTOSCATOLOGY, came from New Dawn, and many of them were originally in Paranoia as well. But I have an article coming out called Freemasons from Outer Space, and it's entirely about analyzing the Masonic symbolism in extraterrestrial abduction stories going way back. And I start out the article by talking about a very vivid dream that I had on February 17th, 1998. And so do you mind if I read to you an excerpt from this article? It's only it's one page, and this is the dream as I experienced it on February 17th, 1998. And this is long before I was a Freemason and long before I ever thought of being a Freemason. It says, I walk into the Masonic Lodge on Cabrillo Avenue in Torrance, a building I've never before entered. I find myself sitting in a waiting room that contains a lot of empty wooden chairs. I look up at the walls. I see a very realistic painting depicting the face of a white owl. I glance back at the empty chairs, then turn to look once more at the painting. Now the white owl has changed. Its face has merged seamlessly with the attributes of an owl and that of an alien gray, as seen on the cover of Whitley Strieber's 1987 book Communion. In 2015, a ufologist named Mike Clellan published a book called The Messengers, Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee, in which Clellan reports that many abductees often first see their abductors in the form of owls. But in 1998, I had no knowledge that anyone believed owls and extraterrestrials were in any way connected. In the dream, I'm not surprised by this shift. I simply continue staring at the empty chairs. After a while, I glance back at the painting. Now the owl is gone, and the impassive face of a gray alien has taken its place. At this point, I rise from that uncomfortable little chair in the waiting room, stroll into the hall, and approach a pair of ornate wooden doors above which are carved the words Masonic Research Center. I push the doors open and see a vast library of old, rare books on the other side. I very much want to begin reading them all. One particular volume stands out at the bottom of the shelf. I pull out the hefty tome and lift it. In the dim light, the title on the cover is unusually clear and is rendered in Gothic golden lettering, The Freemasons and the Guffey Clan Through the Ages. I don't get a chance to read the book or even open it. Suddenly, I notice that strange, surreal creatures are wandering around in the musty, dust-speckled aisles. They weave in and out of the crowds of normal-looking humans, all of them elderly men who are standing in the stacks looking at old books as well. The creatures appear to have emerged from a surrealist painting by the likes of a Max Ernst or Remedios Varo, some mad visionary with a bent imagination. The creatures become aware of my presence and begin to hone in on me. So I put the book back on the shelf and run. I find a staircase and traverse the steps two at a time. I pass the second floor, then the third floor, even though the Masonic Lodge in Torrance only has 2 floors. I press my palms against the metal door and emerge under the roof. It's nighttime. To my surprise, there's a helipad on the roof. A helicopter, its blades spinning faster and faster, is waiting for me. For a moment, I think I've escaped the angry creatures in the library. I start moving towards the helicopter, then pause abruptly. An eyeless stone dog stands between me and the helicopter. It's motionless. I know it doesn't want me to pass. Its gray, craggy stone flesh morphs into real skin. The dog, a greyhound, turns bright red. Then it moves towards me, its crimson eyes growing larger and larger. I turn away from the hound and begin to clamber over the side of the roof. Fortunately, in the complete darkness, my palms discover thick hemp ropes down which I climb to the sidewalk below. I'm confident I've escaped, and then I wake up. Now, I wrote that down in 1998. About a year later, in downtown Torrance, which is where I was living at the time, I go into a health food store that had been there since I was a kid. Like before there was most people thought there was no need for health food stores, like when I was a kid. It was a strange thing. But there was a little Asian woman and her husband who had this health food store in downtown Torrance. And so I went in there like early 1999 to go get, I don't know what it was, some herb or something. And the woman who worked there was a wizened old Asian woman whose name was Mitzi. And you would talk to her, and she was, I would describe it as casually psychic. in other words, she wasn't sitting there dressed like a gypsy with tarot cards, wanting money to tell you your fortune or to read your mind. She would just in the midst of a conversation just throw out something that no one can know about you, and she would do it so casually. It was almost like what just happened? Like you have whiplash. Like, how did you know that? And then she would just shrug, as if it was no big deal, as if she didn't even know she was doing it.
Oh, I love that.
And so she at this point, her husband had died several years earlier, and she's talking to me, and she suddenly tells me, she says that her husband had been a 33rd degree Freemason. Or she said he was a Freemason, and I said, what degree? She said only 33rd. I said only 30. There's only 33. But she said only 33rd, and then I said she points at me. She goes, "You're going to be a Freemason," and I said, "I go no, I don't. I mean, I knew what the Freemasons were. In fact, I had already written an article about Masonic symbolism in Macbeth by that point, which I had written when I was an undergraduate for a Shakespeare class, and the teacher tried to give me an F on it, and I had to go above her head and get it turned into an A, which is exactly what it deserved. But she just casually tells me, "You're going to be a Freemason." I go, "No, I'm not. I have no interest in that. I'm not. I've never been a joiner. I was never in the Boy Scouts. I can't imagine the circumstances under which that would occur. That's not going to happen." She goes, "No, you're going to be a Freemason." The flash forward 2002, and now I'm joining the Freemasons. Now the road between those two things is very convoluted, but so I can't go through every single nook and cranny on the road there. But I can tell you that in '99 I met Walter Boart, and Walter Boart wrote Operation Mind Control, which it was good that I read that, because that later gave me the grounding in which to be able to write CHAMELEO. But Operation Mind Control was the first book to really examine the CIA's MK Ultra program and how deep and destructive it had been. And it came out in 1978. So I meet Walter Boart around 1999, and he had moved to Santa Monica, and we even collaborated on a screenplay together called The Other Crusades, which was based on Walter's attempts to keep LSD legal. That whole screenplay was about Walter's involvement in the early days of LSD. Walter had not only had he written Operation Mind Control, but he was the editor. He had founded the East Village Other, which was the premier underground newspaper on the East Coast. And he had published early Bukowski and early Robert Crumb, and he published Ishmael Reed's first novel serialized in the newspaper. So Boart had a tremendous impact, and it was wild hearing his stories of those days in the '60s. And Boart told me that he was joining the Freemasons, and the reason was that he was adopted. And his real name was Kirby, Walter Kirby, which is, we were just talking about Steve Ditko earlier in terms of synchronistic names, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, but Walter's real name was Kirby, and it had taken him many years to find out who his father had really been. And by the time he found out, his father was dead, and either his mother or some other living relative had given him a box of his father's belongings, and in the box was the Masonic apron and the Masonic scepter and all this Masonic regalia. And Walter had always been fascinated by that stuff anyway, just like somehow it was in his DNA. And so he decided this was something he needed to do. So he joined the Fauché Lodge in Culver City, and he got through the first degree. But the thing is that Walter is not with us any longer. He passed away in 2007, December of 2007, from cancer. But Walter was such a he had to tilt at every windmill, right? So they told him, like, look, you got to memorize all this stuff. You know, every time you go through each degree, you have to memorize more and more stuff, and you have to say it back, you know, precisely, exactly the way. It's like obscure prose poetry, like archaic prose poetry that you have to memorize and then say exactly right. And I think Walter, that was just completely like, Walter's brain couldn't handle that. He actually proposed that he rewrite it as a rap song so that he could remember it, which I thought was a brilliant idea, but they didn't go for it. I would love to have heard that rap song.
Version, yes. Oh my God.
And so they were not willing to adapt to Walter's ideas, and so he never got past the first degree at the Fauché Lodge. But I said to Walter, you know, I'm interested in joining. Would you like take me down to the Fauché Lodge? And he goes, you know, that time all the way in Santa Monica, you're in Torrance. Why don't you just walk down the street, the one that's down the block? You know, which is the one that I had dreamed about. Because I had grown up in Torrance and at 1807 Cabrillo, apartment 4, which was the apartment I lived in all my childhood.
Of course.
and down the street, just a few blocks, was the Blue Lodge, the Masonic Lodge. I'd walk by it all the time, and then as I got older, I wondered about it. Like, what are they doing there? And my mom was like, I don't know. And so Walter goes, just go down the street. So I was like, okay. And so I go down the street to the Blue Lodge, and I walk in, and there's a guy there, and I say, where do you apply to be a Mason? And he goes, oh, well, here's the application. The guy goes, why do you want to join? And I said, at that time, I was in the MFA program at CSU Long Beach, and I had noticed that some of my favorite writers in the late 19th century and early 20th century had either been Masons or related. They were in related secret societies, whether it was Theosophy or Rosicrucianism or Freemasonry. And we're talking, you know, Bram Stoker, Robert Louis Stevenson, H. Rider Haggard, Edgar Rice Burroughs, L. Frank Baum, who wrote the Wizard of Oz books, was very much into Theosophy. So was Edgar Rice Burroughs. And so Jules Verne's books are festooned with esoteric symbolism, and I could go on with other examples, but I said to the guy, well, the reason I want to join is I want to understand the symbolism. You know, I analyze literature as a part of being, you know, a graduate student in English. And I think I'd be able to analyze this literature better if I understood the symbolism better. Because there's a difference between reading about something. I mean, you could read about going through the third degree or read about Masonic symbolism, but it's not quite the same as actually going through it.
Right.
You know, it's like trying to describe to someone going through the third degree who hasn't gone through it is like trying to describe to a blind man a spiral staircase without waving your arms in the air. You know, it's just something you need to experience for yourself. And I kind of just intuitively understood that. And I said that was the reason. And he said, he didn't say anything. I go, is that a good reason? And he goes, oh, I've never heard that reason. It's not a bad reason. I can't see it as being bad. So, okay. And then I was surprised because it just so happened I was there. This was the master of the lodge I was talking to, and and I started throwing out. I said, you know, I've read Manly P. Hall, you know, his classic encyclopedia, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, many other Manly P. Hall works, C.W. Leadbeater. I'm throwing out these names, right? And he's staring at me blankly, and I don't quite know why he's looking at me with a blank expression on his face. After I get that talking, he goes, yeah, he goes, that's interesting. I don't know any of who those people are.
Oh, wow.
But that sounds fascinating. Like maybe you could like recommend some books I could read. While I'm there talking to him, I see that there's a door. And in my dream, there was a door that said Masonic Research Center. And here it didn't say Masonic Research Center, but there was a closed ornate door, and it said Masonic Library above it. And I said, "Can I go in there?" And he goes, "Oh no, you have to go through the first degree before you can go in there." And I go, "Oh, okay, that's cool." So then, you know, you pay the application fee. Then they send people out to go interview either your family, or if you're married, they'll interview your wife.
Yep.
And if the wife like has a problem with it, they'll just back off.
Yeah.
Like if the wife says, "I don't know if I want him involved in this stuff," at that point they will just back off and not pursue it. So at that point, I was living with my parents. I was going to, as I said, I was in the MFA program at CSU Long Beach. So they wanted to talk to my parents. They sent 3 people out to go. Everything comes in threes, right? So they send 3 people out to go interview people you know and stuff. And then once that's done, they then go through a process of, you know, you've heard the whole black ball, white ball term, you know, blackballing someone, because they send, you know, a box around, and if they don't agree that you should join, the person will put in a black ball, you know, and if there's one black ball, you don't get in, you're blackballed. So it has to be everyone has to agree. It has to be all white balls. So apparently they agreed, and I get in. I go through the first degree, and after the first degree, I go, "Can I go in the library?" They're like, "No, you gotta go through the second degree before you go into the Masonic Library." And okay, I guess the first guy, you know, either misspoke or whatever. So then I go through the second degree, and at the end of it, I go, "Can I go in the Masonic Library now?" They go, "You got to go through the third degree before you can go into the you have to be a Master Mason before you can go into the Masonic Library, of course." So and then, by the way, in between the second and third degree, I wrote a short story called Cryptopolis that was partly inspired by my anxiety of imagining what the third degree was going to be like. So it's kind of a horror story, partly inspired by a dream that my dad had. So remind me, and I'll go back and tell you about that. So then I go through the third degree, and at the end of it, I go, "Can I go into the Masonic Library?" They said, "Sure." So they take me in, and they open the doors, and I go into the Masonic Library, and I go inside. And what's on the other side of the ornate door marked Masonic Library is a single shelf filled with a few books that I could get at any thrift store.
Oh dear.
And my library at home is 10 times better, has better Masonic material than any of the books that are at the Masonic Library on the other side of the ornate door, which I thought was particularly appropriate.
At that lodge, yeah.
At that lodge, yes. And then, and it's interesting because when I began to talk to the other Masons, I realized that this guy, when he looked at me blankly when I mentioned Leadbeater or Manly P. Hall, that was not an anomaly. I don't think any one of them had ever read anything by Manly P. Hall or knew who he was. They knew Albert Pike's name and had probably flipped through Morals and Dogma, maybe a couple of, had read a few sentences.
Yeah.
And I discovered that they don't, as a friend of mine commented, they almost don't need to know. The rituals they're very, they're all very dedicated people, and they're extremely dedicated to doing the rituals correctly.
Yes.
And everything has to be in play. I once wondered if I thought, were these secret societies created by obsessive compulsives to justify their own OCD disorders, before that was labeled as such? But my friend commented, they almost don't need to know, as long as they're doing their rituals correctly in the way that they have always been done. You almost don't need to know the symbolism behind it.
No, but the symbols are alive by doing the rituals, and that's how they live.
And of course, the symbolism is such that, Freemasonry is essentially an organization composed entirely of symbols and metaphors.
Yes.
And Ray Bradbury, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a book called Zen and the Art of Writing, which I usually assign in my creative writing classes when I teach creative writing at CSU Long Beach. The one text I assign, because most books about creative writing are unreadable and completely useless. But Zen and the Art of Writing by Bradbury is more, it's not a how-to, it's more inspirational, like essays about creativity and how to inspire creativity. And in there, he says, the key to any story is metaphor. What is the metaphor? Finding metaphors in real life and realizing how that turns into a story. And if you have an idea, but you don't have the metaphor behind it, you don't have anything. And so Freemasonry is all about metaphors, symbols, and enacting those symbols and creating metaphors, manifesting them in reality.
Yes.
So mote it be, right?
Exactly.
And so what I later found out, particularly after meeting Richard Schoengert, and I then later met other Masons too at other lodges. Like I went to the Fauché Lodge, which was the one that Walter never got through. And I interviewed Stephen Heller, who is the bishop of the Gnostic Church in Los Angeles, and he's a high degree. He's also a member of the Fauché Lodge. Meeting other Masons, that there are Masons who are interested in the history of it and where it came from and the symbolism and the metaphor.
I think there's
and
a
meeting
revival actually happening.
Yeah, to some degree, yes. In fact, I began to notice that soon after I got into it, because when I entered the Blue Lodge, and then I went through the 32nd degree at age 32.
Uh-huh. Oh,
at age 32, nice. I went through the 32nd degree which was in 2004 at the Scottish Rite in Long Beach. I noticed that there was a vast gap between the ages. Everyone was either in their 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, like World War II generation people, and then there were like people in their 20s coming in.
Yeah.
So yeah, that right there tells you that something is going on. I don't know if it's like the National Treasure movies and Dan Brown and the popularization of Hermetic symbolism in popular media that's causing that. But you do see a certain uptick in interest in younger people. Though I used to know someone who was a co-Mason. Co-Masonry is considered to be a clandestine lodge by traditional Freemasons. In other words, a clandestine lodge means not an official Masonic lodge. But the co-Masons were started in France, and that co-Masons accept the membership of women.
Yes.
And knowing this one woman who was a co-Mason, we kind of compared notes, and I was fascinated by the fact that the co-Masons seemed more interested in the occult side of Freemasonry, whereas most traditional Masons are almost afraid of it.
Yes.
They don't want to talk about it, and yet it's the heart of the whole thing.
It is the heart. I think one of the things, I come from a long Masonic family. It's in the Oddfellows and Eastern Star, all of it. And one of the things I noticed was it was just something you did. The family did it. Everyone before you did it, so you were going to do it. And what I noticed in my generation was all of a sudden it seemed like there was a sweep where there was a freedom where it wasn't forced on you to join these brotherhoods or sisterhoods. And so there's the lull, there's the gap that happened, and you had all the World War tours up into, that's the gap I noticed from being in a long line of them. I saw it in my own family. But I saw it all over, and those old timers were just in it to at least in my family. I don't think many of them were really deeply into any of the more occult side of it. I think they were just in it because that's what they were doing, getting the Shriners and do good for the community, help help the Brotherhood out, and it was it was an outlet. And so, but what I had noticed in this last generation was, I know so many Masons now, they're very into the historical stuff and definitely into the occult, the beautiful aspect of the cultish stuff. Where do these symbols, where are they from? What are they, how are they operating? How are they overlaying? What's tied in here, and the mystery of it all.
I did an interview with Richard Schellinger, who plays a huge role in my book CHAMELEO, because he's a scientist, and he's also a Scottish Rite Mason. I met him, and we were both part of the same Scottish Rite temple in Long Beach. He's also a Rosicrucian. So I did an interview with him that was in Nexus magazine a couple years ago, where I simply focused on, wanted to know how his history with Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry led to his inventing this particular form of optical camouflage. That was the main subject of my book CHAMELEO. And he said in there that when he joined the Masons, having a science background, he noticed that there was a lot of symbolism in the first 3 degrees that related to science, and to esoteric science particularly, but that none of the other members of the lodge seemed to be aware of that. However, when he joined the Rosicrucians, there were more people there who were aware of that aspect to it, of sort of the higher levels, the hidden levels. And Richard became a Mason in the 50s while serving in the Navy on Guam. So that was way back in the 50s.
Yeah.
And I came into my Blue Lodge in 2002, and most of the people, it's funny, most people who don't know any Freemasons tend to think that all Freemasons are like old white guys. And in my lodge, it's like 90% Filipino. Everyone's from the Philippines.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And this is something I got directly from them. This is not my interpretation of it. What the master of the lodge in the second year I was there said to me, he said, in the Philippines are like 100 years behind the United States in some respects, and Freemasonry is much more important there than it is here. In the Philippines, it's very important if you want to move up in business, yes, to be a Freemason. A lot of deals are made in the lodge, etc. Kind of like, the United States in 1919 as opposed to 2019.
It's old school.
So I was fascinated that some people would come through, some young Filipino guys would come in I've never seen before, and they'd come in and be initiated. They'd go through the 3rd degree, and then I would never see them again. And I asked the master of the lodge about this, and he said, "Oh yeah, well, it's so difficult to get into the Freemasons of the Philippines that they'll fly here, get initiated here, and then fly back, and then they can use it to their advantage, to go up the social ladder in the Philippines." So there you have, obviously they don't care about the esoteric symbolism, or where all this stuff came from. In fact, when I met Richard, I had already been accepted into the Shriners. I had applied, and I was going to go into the Shriners. And then Richard said, I really wouldn't advise that. And I said, why? And he goes, you seem to me more like me, like you're interested in the history of this. And he goes, the Shriners are the antithesis of that. It's a giant frat party. Yeah, is what it is. And
it's the
I
exoteric
really wouldn't
side.
recommend you waste your time.
But you can have fun in the little cars.
It's almost the exoteric side of Freemasonry.
I am. It is unfortunate that I wasn't able to drive around in the little car. But with the feds,
join the several orders. I mean, you can be a royal jester and a Shriner. I mean,
oh well, of course. It's interesting how everyone knows. Well, most people know about Freemasons, but there's all these there's hundreds of esoteric orders that no one knows about. And one of those is the Royal Order of the Jesters, which you just mentioned. And most people don't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Was he? Did he say mirth is king?
You know, his name was Forrest Bain out of Ottumwa, Iowa, if you want to find him. But actually, he's now passed. But he's the one who he joined. First of all, I didn't know this. I was young, but he said they approached him, right?
Yeah.
So he wasn't even aware of them at some point in his journey, but his father was one, and so he did like his father when he got out of the war. He's a boomer. And so I think he had already been a Shriner and then got approached. But when when he was on his deathbed for double lung transplant, after my Momo had died, his sister, he was feeling very generous with stuff that he kept really private, because though we're Eastern Stars and Oddfellows and stuff, we didn't know what other orders he was involved in within the Masonic avenue. And so he brought out boxes of goodies and was showing us and telling us stories. So that's when I first heard about the the Jesters.
That's interesting, because it's interesting that you said he was approached, because of course in Freemasonry, it's actually strictly, you're not allowed to approach anyone in Freemasonry. If you're in terms of the 1 through 32nd degree, it's either in the Blue Lodge or the York Rite,
right,
or Scottish Rite. You're not supposed to go up to anyone and say, "Hey, you should be a Freemason." You can tell people, "I'm in the Mason. This is what it's like," and if they bring it up, then that's fine. But that's why you see in the bumper stickers, "To be one, ask one," right? You're supposed to ask and not be approached. But in this case, of course, you can't ask, because many of them don't even know that there is a Royal Order of the Jesters.
Yeah.
And then you might be interested to know that once you get up to the top of the Royal Order of the Jesters, you might be approached by another organization.
Yes, exactly. That was what and that's why I'm not going to talk about this on air, but that's what I had learned, straight from my uncle Forrest. So, and he kept all that so tight-lipped that our core family is really tight. And, we did not know this. This was in him thinking he was not going to survive the lung issue. His little baby sister, my mother, just died. And so he was feeling very open, and it was great.
I by the way, this is possibly meaningless, but I was at the Blue Lodge, and it was after one of the rituals, and I was sitting around, I was looking at everybody at the lodge, and I thought to myself, which guy here would be a jester? Which is the guy here who would be a jester? And so there was one particularly loud guy. Loud, and I guess you could describe him as obnoxious.
Yes.
So there was a guy I knew they were both sitting at the same table. And there was a guy I knew who in fact had been one of my coaches, who was sitting on the opposite side of the end of this round table with this other guy who I thought, if there's a jester here, it's that guy. So I sit next to the guy I knew who had been my coach. And I sit down next to him, because I know if I just go up to this guy and ask him about the jester, he's not going to tell me anything. Yeah. So I sat down next to the guy who I knew who had been my coach. I sit next to him and we're talking, and then I just casually say to him, "What's up with the jesters?" And so the coach goes, "Oh, the Royal Order of the Jesters?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, I don't know." He goes, I'm not a member of the Jesters." And then he goes, hey. And he calls out to the guy on the other end of the table. He goes, "Aren't you a jester?" And then the guy goes, "Yeah." I knew it. And so now it's not me asking, it's the other guy.
Yes.
And so now, because the other guy asked, now he just starts talking. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, we meet every at the beginning of the month at the Los Angeles Athletic Club. In fact, earlier this month, the keynote address was given by the chief of police of the LAPD. It's like, oh, that's, so the chief of the LAPD is a jester. Okay. And then I go, do you always meet at the Los Angeles Athletic Club? And he goes, yeah, that's generally where we get together. And I go, so what did the jesters do? And he goes, we have fun. We have fun. And the next time now, this is fantastic, because you can't make this up. You can't make this up. The guy who had been my coach, he sends me an email. He goes, hey, you might want to come down to the lodge next week, because we've got a celebrity coming, being initiated into the lodge in Torrance. I go, well, who is it? He goes, it's Roddy Piper. Oh. Now, I go, my brain is exploding, because, of course, Roddy Piper is the star of They Live, yes. One of the greatest films ever made. They Live is, in fact, a documentary, metaphorically. It's a metaphorical documentary.
Which John Carpenter denies, by the way.
Well, I would deny it, too, if I was John Carpenter.
Yes, of course.
There's this, right? The scene where he first puts on the glasses. It's the greatest. It's one of the greatest scenes of any film ever. Is where he first puts on the glasses and goes out, and now he's decoding all the billboards and the ads and what they're really saying. Roddy Piper immediately after putting on the sunglasses, he turns the corner and he immediately passes the Los Angeles Athletic Club. I noticed that was after I had talked to this guy about that. He said that's where the jesters meet. I watched They Live soon after that and noticed the Los Angeles Athletic Club right there in the background as Roddy Piper puts on the sunglasses and then walks down the street. So note that the next time you watch it. So anyway,
I've never known that. That is genius.
And then so he tells me that Roddy Piper is being initiated, and I was like, that's just mind-boggling. And for various reasons, I could not attend the night that he was initiated, which I kick myself for this to this very day. But when I saw They Live in the theater with my girlfriend in high school in 1988, I did not think that later in 2003 I would be lodge brothers with Roddy Piper. That's very strange.
It's really genius. I'm friends with one of the members of the Reseda Lodge, the 666 Lodge.
I have a friend. In fact, he's a UFO researcher, Randy Kopang, who lives in Reseda. In fact, he's lived in Reseda most of his life. He wrote a book called Camouflage Through Limited Disclosure, which is like postgraduate level UFO book. And Randy lives in Reseda, and his grandfather had been a Mason. And in fact, Randy had been a Masonic mascot when he was a kid. They had him hold this Masonic sword in this ceremony, etc. But yes, I'm very familiar with Reseda, and I've never been to that lodge, but my friend Randy, his family remembers of that lodge.
Yeah, they're fantastic. William is the person I know, and say his last name, but okay, we have drifted.
A little bit. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Have a good night.
While we're still here, though, your dad's dream with the Master Mason, I have question marks.
Oh, yes. My dad had a dream that he was very vivid, and I remember him telling me the dream, and he said the dream was that he was floating. He was flying over a city, and he described to me what the city looked like, and he said they were like all these little houses, and everything was gray, and all the houses looked exactly the same, and they all had like little lights on, like the one light on up in the second story of each of these little houses. And he described the little city to me, and he was floating through the city, like through between the houses, and he was describing what it looked like, and he floated past the pier, and he said it was like he was floating through like a little toy city, but it wasn't small. It was big, but there was like no life in it. And he woke up gasping for breath, and his description of that city was so vivid that I used it as the description. I wrote a story called Cryptopolis, crypto secret polis meaning city, right? So secret city, and Cryptopolis appeared in a magazine called Phantom Drift. I think issue number 2, I believe. And Cryptopolis was written in between going through the 2nd degree and the 3rd degree. And so it's kind of a horror story because it reflects my anxiety of what was going to happen in the 3rd degree. And then after I went through the 3rd degree, I wrote a follow-up story that's linked thematically, at least it is in my mind. The story is called Initiation. And that story you can actually find online because it was published by Rudy Rucker. Rudy Rucker is a brilliant science fiction writer who started a webzine called Flurb, F-L-U-R-B. And so I was very proud to be, I wrote 3 short stories for him when he was doing Flurb. And I shared a table of contents page with, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling and John Shirley and all these major science fiction writers. So this particular story is called Initiation. And if you read that, know that story was written immediately after having gone through the 3rd degree. And so it has a different tone than Cryptopolis, which was written between the 2nd and the 3rd. So Initiation that story was not inspired by a dream, but it's certainly purposely dreamlike in its structure and its imagery. So you might be interested in reading that.
I'm definitely going to look that up. Hopefully Jerry links that for me, the princess treatment. I'm definitely interested.
What was it called? I missed the title.
The story is called Initiation, and it's in a Rudy Rucker's magazine called Flurb. So if you just like Google Flurb Initiation Robert Guffey, you'll probably come across it. Okay. And illustrated by Rudy Rucker's paintings, and photographs, which is cool.
Which are interesting. I am familiar with Rudy, and I don't know if I invited him to be a guest, but he's on my list.
That would be a fantastic show.
Yeah, he used to write for Omni, I think. That's where I first read.
Oh, yes. Yes. The first Rucker story I read was called Tales of Houdini in a book called Mirror Shades, which was a cyberpunk anthology. Tales of Houdini, that's a fantastic. And also Rucker, I really recommend his book, The Hollow Earth and Return to the Hollow Earth, which is about Edgar Allan Poe is a character in the book, and you see how he came up with the idea for narrative of A. Gordon Pym, Poe's only novel, because Poe actually went to the Hollow Earth and experienced it. And we learned this secret history in The Hollow Earth by Rudy Rucker. Highly recommend that Rucker novel.
All right. I will check that out.
I want to get some of the nuts and bolts out of the way just a little bit. Were you an only child?
No, I have. As I said, everything comes in threes. There were 3 of us, 3 brothers. I was the youngest. The oldest was 10 years older than me.
Oh.
The second youngest, 8 years older than me.
Oh.
So obviously, I think it's safe to assume that I wasn't planned.
Of course not.
I don't know. I've never come out and asked specifically, but that's my impression. But so yes, I had 2 older brothers.
Were you brought up with religion at all?
My parents never raised me with any kind of religion at all. Though my dad was raised an Irish Catholic. In fact, I remember watching the Belushi movie, Blues Brothers, the Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi movie, Blues Brothers, with the crazy nun.
How much for the little one?
That scene, I watched that when I was a kid, and my dad turned to me, he said, "That's exactly what Catholic school was like. That's exactly what it was like."
It's true.
That is non-exaggeration. And he would tell me stories about, raising his hand and asking some innocuous question, and then the answer would just be like a swipe at the side of his head, with the ruler. So he had no particular respect for religion. I don't. But then again, at the same time, I don't remember them ever saying anything that was negative against it, except for that, saying, yeah, this is exactly what it was like being at a Catholic school.
My father loved
I don't
to,
remember
I'm
any
sorry.
impression one way or the other, really.
My dad loved to show us his scars from the rulers that hit his knuckles as a child.
Oh my goodness.
I've got a personal synchro with the Blues Brothers thing because I was an extra in the Civic Center scene.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Excellent, Jared.
That
I
is
didn't know that.
Yeah, I was a freshman in high school.
That's awesome.
That is synchronistic linguistics right there. That's pretty amazing.
Yep.
I just realized just now that I have a book called Spies and Saucers, which is a collection of 3 novellas that all take place in the 1950s. And the first story is called The Fallen Nun. And it's all about this nun that falls out of the sky and lands in this guy's marijuana garden up in Malibu. And it's 1959, so the guy, he doesn't know if he should call the cops because now there's this dead nun lying face down in his marijuana garden. But if he does call the cops, they're going to see the marijuana garden, so he's not sure what to do. And then these 2 men in black types show up, knock at the door, and then it spirals out from there into being about smoking the reptilian skin of an alien, which triggers spontaneous time travel, and flying to the moon, and all this other stuff. But it just occurred to me that there's a kid, that nun character who's quite strident in this story. It just occurred to me that maybe she's based on that. My dad telling me about the nuns that raised him. Maybe that's where I got the idea for the fallen nun story.
I often think these things are connected, and somehow we don't see it until a later review when we're, and like this, we're talking, and then there's a dot and a dot and a line.
Absolutely, it's like therapy.
Well, with that said, how much of your work, which is to me, which is art really, has been informed by your dream world? You did give us a little bit of that earlier.
I've written a lot of stories that were actually just directly dreams that became stories, and there was a story I wrote that was published also in the Phantom Drift, the same magazine that published Cryptopolis. This story, The Sheet, was published in 2017. It's called The Sheet. That is the name of the story. And this dream I had in January of 2001, and it was a very vivid dream. And I was in the dream, I leap out of bed and I run into the hall and I'm naked. And it's early in the morning, like 6 a.m. or something. And there's kind of like a diffuse kind of gray sunlight coming in through the bathroom window, because I run from the bed with my sheet in my hands, and it's a beige sheet with the word sleep printed all over the sheet. Sleep, 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 sleep. And I grab the sheet and I run down the hall into the bathroom, and I start shoving the sheet down the toilet, and I keep flushing it until the whole sheet goes down the toilet. The second the last wisp of the corner of the sheet goes down, swirling down the drain, a rumbling occurs. It's this giant roaring, like an earthquake, like the 7.1 earthquake that just shook California the other day. That was pleasant. And it was like an earthquake. And so the whole building, and I'm in an apartment building, 2-story apartment building. The whole building begins to quake the second the sheet goes down the toilet, and it starts to move. And the whole building is rumbling down the street. It's crushing houses and cars, and fire hydrants are being knocked out of the way. And I'm trying to hold on, and the whole building somehow goes up onto an on-ramp onto the 405. So now the whole building is just careening down the 405, and everything's shaking. And I hear a helicopter up above, and I leave the apartment. I don't know if I put on clothes or I can't remember. Probably put on some clothes. Go out into the second floor landing, and there's a rickety wooden ladder going up to the roof. So I climb the ladder, and I go up there, and I see there's another tenant up on the roof already, like a next door neighbor. And I go up there, and there's a helicopter hovering above us, and it's either a news helicopter or a rescue helicopter, and they send down like a rope ladder down to the building so that we can climb it and get onto the helicopter. me and the tenant, the neighbor, reject the rope ladder entirely and decide we don't want to leave. So we go back down the wooden ladder and we go to the neighbor's apartment. We sit there and we start listening to old radio shows from the 1930s, like X-1, The Shadow. And we're just sitting there listening to the radio show as the whole building's still rumbling and careening towards Santa Monica, the Santa Monica Pier, like towards the beach. And we listen to radio shows just calmly for like maybe 20 minutes or so, a half hour. Then everything starts to shake in a different way as the whole building has now gone into the ocean and is sinking. And me and the neighbor go out onto the second floor landing, and there's all these other people in the apartment building looking up in fear up at the wooden ladder going up to the building, going up to the roof. And all of them are looking up and not wanting to climb the ladder for some reason, as if they're scared. And now water starts to rise, or rather, actually, the building is sinking into the Pacific Ocean. And so, at the last minute, all the other people in the building start clambering up the ladder. But there's too many people, and it's too late, and they all go like falling into the water. Me and the neighbor just go back into his apartment where we were listening to the radio shows, and we turn on the TV. And my neighbor hits 00 on the remote control. And on the screen, on the 00 channel, you can access your past dreams. So it on the screen is the dream I was having right before I woke up and started flushing the sheets down the toilet. And it's a nightmare. And on the screen, you can see what the dream was. And I'm in a cocoon, a silk cocoon, with spiders all over me. And I'm hanging above a ornate, like marble spiral staircase that descends down into darkness. And the only choice is either to sink into the ocean or to climb back in through the screen back into the nightmare that I was having before. The tenant, for some reason, the image on the screen disturbs him, and so he runs out and sinks into the ocean with everyone else. I decide to jump into the screen back into the nightmare because there's no choice. So now I'm back in the nightmare I was having. I'm wrapped in the silk cocoon. There's spiders crawling all over me. And I start swinging back and forth to try to dislodge myself from the silk cocoon. And all that manages to happen is that it snaps the thin silk thread that is holding the cocoon aloft. And I tumble down the staircase wrapped in this silk cocoon all the way down to the bottom, where there's a bunch of people, like shadowy, faceless, a crowd of shadowy, faceless people at the base of the staircase. And I go roll and tumble all the way down, bones breaking. As I'm tumbling down the staircase, I land plop on the beach, and there's a vast ocean of crimson water, like it's an ocean of blood. And now my arms and legs are completely useless. And I try to crawl kind of like the armless, legless man in Freaks, who kind of rolls around on his torso, the living torso, he was called.
Yes.
Kind of like that. I try to squirm away still with my broken arms and my broken legs, wrapped in this cocoon, tried to get away from the stairwell, and I ended up going into the ocean and drowning. And I woke up. Now, that was a very vivid dream, and I immediately wrote it down. And it stayed in my notebook for years. And then it was like December of 2016, and I was sick. And I pulled out an old notebook, and I found the dream. Now, what fascinates me is sometimes you can write something, particularly when you were younger, you can write something that you thought was really fantastic. Like, man, I just wrote something that's amazing. And then you look back and you're like, oh, man, that was terrible. But then there can be something that you just dashed off without thinking about it, and that can be far more durable than the thing that you thought was so great. So I found this dream in there, and I thought, it just needs an ending. And so I came up with, like, I just added the final paragraph, which I thought it felt like appropriate that it took that long for me to understand like what the ending of the story should be. And then I submitted it to Phantom Drift, and they bought it on first submission. And so it appeared in Phantom Drift in October of 2017. Yeah, it's called The Sheet. And I kind of like the ostensibly quotidian, mundane nature of the title, just
Right.
and then the noun. And it doesn't sound like it's going to be that interesting.
Well, and just the fact that is incredible, by the way. I am just applauding that. Just the fact that the sheet has sleep all over it too was, just that little detail alone. And then
Oh
this
yeah, that's fantastic.
zero access to past dreams. That's pretty genius.
Yes, it's almost it's like a meta dream, because it starts out after a dream has occurred. That, my memory of the dream is that it begins with me waking up, and that's not until later on that I realized, oh, that was why I woke up. Was because of that nightmare I was having, and then to go back into the nightmare you didn't know you were having. That's very layered.
It's so good. Oh, Robert, it's so good. This is why your writing is so good. I love it. So, all right, tell us how you. So we've got an idea of how you dream, and it's out there. What about things like OBEs and lucidity within the dreams? It already sounds to me like at least your dreams are very vivid, and sometimes I associate the quality of extreme vividness, is that even a word, as a pathway to getting to lucidity.
It's interesting. I've experienced lucid dreaming a couple of times, very minutely. I mean, for a second, I was aware I was in the dream, and controlling it for like, it feels like a microsecond before I woke up, and it's only happened like a couple of times. I've never attempted to do it. I've never tried. I've never gone through any exercises, right, to try to spark it on purpose. But the first time was when I was very young, like 12, and I had never heard the phrase lucid dreaming. But I did realize I was dreaming, and I started doing things, mundane things, nothing. I mean, it's sort of like you suddenly have the keys to the kingdom, and then you just squander it. I should have been flying or something, and instead I don't know, I manifested the comic book I wanted that week or something. I don't even remember what it was. I just remember that briefly I was able to control what I was doing. And then I woke up, and then maybe it happened one more time years later. So I haven't had that much experience with that in particular, but I've had experiences with, I don't know if you would call it shared dreaming or not, but actually I don't even know what category to put this particular story in, but this happened in 2006. I was reading, we just, before we went on the air, we were talking about the year 1994, because that's the year Secret Cipher of the UFO Knots came out by Alan Greenfield, which I read when it came out. But another book I read in 1994 was The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings by John A. Keel, which was a revision and update of a book he wrote in 1970 called Strange Creatures from Time and Space. But I hadn't read the original edition. I read this newer edition called The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings. And in that book is a chapter called Bedroom Invaders. And he talks about these red and black plaid shirted men who will appear at the foot of your bed and just stand there. And people have reported seeing this red and black plaid shirted man like through the decade.
It's Flannel Man.
Well, Flannel Man, yes. Yeah. And now what's interesting is, so flash forward to 2006, and I'm in bed with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. And I wake up, and there's a figure standing at the end of my bed. It's not wearing a red and black plaid shirt. You can't see anything about it except that it's a man, clearly the silhouette of a man with a kind of shadowy face. You can't tell any details about color or what he's wearing at all. But I tried to get up and tackle him, and I couldn't because I was paralyzed. So I start to shout, and then I felt my girlfriend waking me up, and she goes, "What were you? What the hell were you dreaming about?" And she goes, "You were shouting in your sleep." And I go, "There was a man at the end of the bed, and I was trying to tackle him, and I couldn't move." And my girlfriend, who's half asleep, mumbles under her breath, was he wearing a red and black plaid shirt? And then she just rolled over on the side, went back to sleep. And I shook her awake, and I go, "What did you just say?" And she goes, "What?" I go, "You asked me if the figure was wearing a red and black plaid shirt. You know, why did you ask me that?" And she goes, "I don't know." and I said, "Did I ever tell you about this John Keel book?" And I pulled it out from the bookshelf across the room. I knew I hadn't. I knew I had never mentioned it to her. And I show her the chapter called Bedroom Invaders in the paragraph where he goes into the red and black plaid shirt. And she goes, "No, you've never showed me that book." And to this day, she doesn't know why she asked me that question. And of course, I've since learned that other people have actually seen the red and black plaid shirt man, you know, standing at the end of the bed. But I thought it was interesting that I actually didn't see the red and black plaid shirt, but my wife asked me about it, even though she knew nothing about it, and she was half asleep at the time.
That's really fantastic. A great example of this, because she wasn't aware, you weren't aware of the flannel man. She's half asleep and brings this piece in. This is incredible.
And now you'll find this interesting, because this is an example of a shared dream, but it's not my dream. This would have been like maybe a year earlier than that, like around 2005. And an ex-girlfriend called me on the phone, the same girlfriend I mentioned who I saw They Live with. So we've remained in touch over the years. She calls me, this is 2005, roundabout, and she tells me this dream she had the night before. And in the dream, she and I had been having sex, even though we haven't been dating for many years, okay? So right after she wakes up from this dream, this erotic dream, her boyfriend, who's sleeping next to her, wakes up in a cold sweat and he's crying. And my ex-girlfriend says to him, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" And he said, "I just had this vivid, realistic dream that you were having sex with Robert." And my ex-girlfriend says, you can't then say at that point, "That's amazing, honey. I had the same exact dream just now." Like, you can't, there's no way to say that, right? So she just says, there, baby, you know, that's just ridiculous. But what I find fascinating about that story is that clearly they were having a shared dream. And who was the originator of the dream? Was it her? Was it him? Was it simultaneous? Is it possible that people who sleep together night after night begin to sync up in the dreamscape? You know, it almost reminds me of, you know, the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. Who wrote that book? Do you know that book? The guy, the professor who did all these experiments with DMT.
Yes, Jerry should know that, actually.
Yeah.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. Whatever his name is.
Rick Strassman.
He did all these. Yeah. Yes, that's right. He did all these tests with DMT, in which he did administer the DMT to two different volunteers, and they were in two different rooms and didn't even know of each other's existence. And then afterwards, when he compared the notes of what both people had experienced while under the influence of the DMT, he found that they sometimes shared the same hallucinations, if you even want to call them hallucinations, you know. But I suspect they're not hallucinations, just like dreams aren't really dreams, right? And so it's just, this whole idea of shared dreams is fascinating. I remember reading once that there were certain Aborigines in Australia who, if they dream about like murdering you or doing something bad to you, the next morning they'll approach you and apologize for what they did to you in the dream the night before. You know, they like take full responsibility for their dreams and their nightmares. I don't even know if they make a clear distinction between the two of them. So I just think it's fascinating that, you could go on and on about the possibilities of sharing dreams and how, because in that case, it's clearly, there's no way to explain it other than that it's a shared dream. You know, I mean, obviously they were having the same dream simultaneously.
I've heard several stories that are similar with people that sleep together in the same beds that do have this overlap. And I've certainly experienced what I considered, I have no way to prove this, and which is another reason why I love actually this topic anyway, with one of my dogs in particular is now passed. I swear she was sentient in the dream. We've had, yet there's no way to prove this, but we would do stuff like we did in waking life, and there was pushback from her. It wasn't like she was a component of my psyche, you know, as a mask for some function. And yeah, I find this fascinating. I have dream shared with people that I was not in bed with, and had full details. Like there are dream groups that do this, where it's almost like remote viewing, where you come in and you give details first before the person's kind of like the dream master unfolds what actually was the target place and what was the goal of the meeting, and had great success with that with some people.
That's fascinating, because that, as I mentioned earlier, that's essentially the plot of Call of Cthulhu.
Yes.
Because in there's all these catastrophes going on, and there's these various sensitives around the world who are having the same dreams. And in that case, implication is, predictive dreams.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard the rumors that the Deepwater Horizon accident was some sort of Cthulhu ritual?
No, that's pretty good. What do you know about it?
That's all I know. I just heard that. One of the internet conspiracy theories. Yeah,
isn't that great?
I would love to know. Yeah, I would love to know more about that. Absolutely. I love Lovecraft. I mean, constantly. I think it's fascinating. For someone, as we said earlier, who's very much an atheist and very really materialist and pragmatic. That so many of his stories have attracted occultists like Kenneth Grant, who Kenneth Grant has written many volumes, sort of analyzing Lovecraft as more as the pope of a new occult age. I'm sure Lovecraft would have been amused by that. And yet, at the same time, you look at the stories, and I read Kenneth Grant's analyses of Lovecraft stories, and I don't think that it's way out there at all. I read Kenneth Grant's analysis, and I think, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yes.
It seems very valid. Either Lovecraft knew all this stuff because he studied it, and was conversant with it in terms of research of mining this kind of material for the fiction, or his subconscious was just plugged into the universe in some weird way that we can't even imagine. That
Which
kind of thing.
I'm a subscriber of that.
So
sure.
do you think some of the Cthulhu, the great old ones, would relate to like the Typhonian stuff, the back of the Tree of Life, and?
Well, this kind of ties into a question you asked me earlier in a weird way. It's going like the long way around Robin Hood's barn, but let's take the detour. You mentioned like early influences, and I already mentioned Steve Ditko earlier. But my dad, you asked me if my dad had ever like raised me with a particular religion. The only religion I know of that my dad behested to me without him knowing it was in the closet. He had a box of coverless comic books. And this was probably the closest to a religious experience that I had as a child. My older brothers had gotten to these comics before me, so they had no covers. They had played with them like toys and stuff, and so the covers had long vanished. But what he had was my dad told me that he had trouble sleeping, and that he couldn't. He worked the night shift at U.S. Steel, which I'm sure was physically and psychically grueling. And he said he couldn't read a book. It was just too much for his eyes to focus on words on the page, but he could focus on a comic book. And so he would buy comic books at Frank's Liquor down in downtown Torrance. And he'd take me down there. He'd buy a 6-pack of beer, horse racing form, and I could pick out a comic book. So I remember buying Jack Kirby's Black Panther comics in the 70s, Devil Dinosaur, Machine Man,
Oh man.
Jack Kirby's Captain America comics from the 70s. Before that, my dad had these comics that went back to the late 60s and earlier. But what was fascinating is my dad didn't know who Jack Kirby was. But invariably, all the comics he bought were either Kirby comics, Neil Adams. He had a good eye for which were the good comics, but he didn't really know anything about it. He just bought them at random. And so later on, I was really impressed that he had like Forever People #1, or the first issue of Jimmy Olsen that Jack Kirby worked on when he left Marvel, went over to DC. This comic book fans will know what I'm talking about. But where I'm getting to is that Jack Kirby has all of this esoteric, hermetic, Rosicrucian, even Masonic symbolism embedded in his work. And I just finished writing an article in which it's 10,000 words, and I focus on the hermetic, esoteric, Rosicrucian, Masonic symbolism in The Incredible Hulk #1. It's just the first issue.
Wow.
Now, most people, upon hearing that, if they're comic book fans or they know who Jack Kirby is, or they would think that's just crazy. Obviously, if you look for anything, you can find it. But the truth is that that's not true. I've tried to find it in other places. You don't see it because it's not there. So I wrote this article, and I gave it to someone I know, and I said, when you read the article and you get to the end, do you think I'm just totally like lost my mind, or do you see like a logical thread? And she said, oh no, I can see it. It's perfect. You lay it out perfectly. You know, the evidence is right there. So, and by the way, you know, comic book fans will know that Jack Kirby worked ostensibly with Stan Lee on these early Marvel comics, the Hulk and all this. And yet, if you look at stuff that Stan Lee did apart from Kirby, the symbolism's not there.
Yeah, it was all Kirby. It was all Kirby. Totally.
It was all Kirby, because then later on, stuff that Kirby did by himself, and he went to DC, and even later, is loaded with it as well. And particularly the Fourth World stuff, the New Gods, the Forever People, which I mentioned earlier, Mr. Miracle. These things are just loaded with it. And if you look into Kirby's background, he grew up in the Bronx, and his parents were very Orthodox Jews. And he tells a story in an interview, and I quote it in the article, about him waking up. He had a fever, some sort of flu or something, and there were 10 rabbis dancing around his bed, chanting, saying things like, "Begone, demon! Leave this boy, demon!" So, and then later on, Kirby does a comic book called The Demon. I consider it to be one of his masterpieces, which is he did for DC in the 70s. And so you see that these things were very real for him, and that he was raised, probably was taught the Kabbalah to a certain extent. And I think that either he was purposely putting it in to the stuff, or it got into his head early on and he didn't even know. Just like what I just said now, where I said, hey, maybe the nun thing came from my dad telling me about the nuns. You know, I mean, maybe Kirby didn't even know he was doing it. But I lay out, like there's one point where I show examples of stuff he did earlier. Some of you know what, this is particularly appropriate. Kirby did a comic book in the 50s called The Strange World of Your Dreams. And the whole concept of the comic was supposed to be that readers would write in their dreams, and then Kirby would illustrate them. Now I suspect that in fact Kirby just made up stories off of his head, and they said they were based on dreams that people had sent in.
Still the idea.
Nonetheless, the idea is fantastic, and each story is now. If you remember, if you're familiar with the horror comics of like the 1950s, like EC Comics, Tales from the Crypt, The Haunt of Fear, they were all narrated by these hosts, like the Crypt Keeper or the Witch, and you would see their face, and they would narrate the horror story as it unfolded. In The Strange World of Your Dreams, it's narrated by a dream analyst. It's narrated by like some Freud-looking guy, and you suddenly are plunged into this comic book that is the 1950s equivalent of Max Ernst in 4 colors stapled, and you could buy it at the spinner rack, you know, for 10 cents or less. And each one is wonderful. And so you can see in there, there's one cover where there's a figure that's clearly you see the cover is depicting some kind of occult ritual, and there's some sort of high priest, like in a cloak, and he's doing the sign of Pan. If you know, like Thelema and Crowley, the sign of Pan is a particular way that you hold your arms. And
Jack Parsons'
the high
favorite.
priest, Jack Parsons' favorite, yeah, absolutely. And so on the cover of this comic, you see the high priest in this ritual is doing that exact sign. And so I put them side by side. So here's Kirby's cover, and here's a photo of Crowley doing it. It's exactly the same, you know. So, I mean, that's just one example that I use. Like, here's a concrete piece of evidence that clearly he knew about it and was putting it in there on purpose. And it's not just a coincidence, you know. And I think that these kind of things that Kirby was putting in there, Phil Dick mentioned often about the whole concept of that the truth hides itself. The truth hides itself in trash. Like if you want to find something that's really impactful, then you got to look where everyone else is not looking.
Yes.
So in the 50s, that's why in the 60s, one of the great, you know, prime movers of esoteric culture was a guy who was drawing comic books in New York, and no art critic was looking at that stuff. No literary critic was looking at that stuff. And the people who were looking at that stuff were kids who had enough money to be able to buy a bunch of those comics and get assaulted by this stuff surreptitiously so that it would worm their way into their heads. And later on, these kids went into the professional world. They became movie executives, and they said, "Hey, let's make movies of these things." and now it's a huge multi-billion-dollar series of films that are also loaded with this imagery that is either on purpose or comes from the fact that it's based on the stuff in the first place that Kirby did. Nonetheless, it's this long train of putting these little secret mind bombs and planting them out of sight in comic books, or in Phil Dick's case, in cheap science fiction paperbacks at the Greyhound spin rack. And the most important artist, Lovecraft, was not recognized in his time.
Right.
His stuff was in Weird Tales, which was certainly not. That wasn't the Smart Set or any of those magazines that Fitzgerald or Hemingway was publishing in. And yet at the same time, and I write about this, by the way, you might be interested in the book I just published, Bela Lugosi and the Monogram 9, which I wrote with a friend, Gary Rhodes, who's a preeminent film scholar. We both love the films of Bela Lugosi. And so there are these particular sequence of 9 films that Lugosi did for Monogram in the 1940s, and no one had ever written about them. No one had ever done a book about them. And so we decided, hey, would it be fun? We'll split them up. We'll each write a chapter about the first film, Invisible Ghost, and then we'll divide them up. I'll do 4, you do 4. And we did. The first one I did, which is about the film Invisible Ghost, is entirely It's called Invisible Ghost, the films of Bela Lugosi as borderline surrealism. And I go in there about the dream-like logic of these B films in the 1940s and how they were, even though they were cheap jack horror films, they were really surrealist films. And that's the beauty of surrealism, is that you don't even need to be aware of surrealism in order to be a surrealist.
Yes.
And a successful one. And in fact, it's better if you're not aware of it. So we're talking about a conspiracy that works entirely on its own, and the conspirators are not aware that they are involved in the conspiracy. So the main tenet, I lay this out in which is the second chapter of the book, the one about Invisible Ghost, and I tie it into Andre Breton and his manifestos of surrealism. Of course, the surrealists were fascinated by Freud and by dreams. And in there, I lay out how Breton said, if you want to be a surrealist, the way to do it is you need to write without any inhibitions. You can't take the time to finesse it, make it perfect. You just need to let the words flow out before your rational mind can even think of what you're doing. And so I argue here that in this particular essay that the B films of the 1940s that Hollywood was making at that time, some of them were made in 3 days. Like the Detour, Edgar Ulmer's Detour, which is one of the classic film noirs, was filmed in 3 days.
So great.
And so these guys were working at such a fast pace that they had no time to think about what they were doing. And that's how you get surrealist masterpieces, because the guys at the front office, the people who are funding this stuff, first of all, they don't care as long as it's making money.
Right.
It's being churned out so fast, they have no way of censoring it. In fact, they don't even care to censor it because they just think they're making junk, so it doesn't matter. And so that's how you get these insane surrealist masterpieces emerging from mainstream Hollywood in the 1940s. And I argue in there that now filmmaking is such big money that there is no room for chance or for accident, and you can't even have right. You can't have art by accident. You know? So, but and I tell this to my creative writing students, because students will come in, they're very dejected. They feel very like that they don't have freedom to write or to speak their mind. And so in my creative writing classes, I try to get them to see, in fact, this is a perfect opportunity for them, because when something, so in the 60s, if you were writing in comic books, that was the place to be. If you didn't want to be, you wouldn't be famous, except maybe amongst a certain circle of people. But if you want to get away with stuff, you go to the place where no one's looking at it. Right.
Yep,
so,
absolutely.
You know, or like making B films or whatever, or writing science fiction like Phil Dick was. Now, it's what Hakeem Bey called the temporary autonomous zone. The autonomous zone always is temporary. It always, that zone where you're perfectly free to do whatever you want, it's always moving. And so you can't expect to get that freedom by, you know, comic books. I mean, there was a time in the 1960s, you're just walking off the street and you got a job writing a comic book, right? You just, it's big business now. You can't do that. So you got to find where is that autonomous zone. And I just a few months ago, I was teaching a creative writing class, and I heard that there was a zine fest in Long Beach. So me and my wife and my daughter, we went down there, and there's all these people in their late teens and early 20s stapling their stories and their artwork together.
Yeah.
Using photocopy machines.
Yes. Yeah.
And the, you know, I mean, you know, we live in an age where you post the wrong thing on Twitter, your life's over. The beautiful thing, however, is that if you staple something to a telephone pole, or if you make a little pamphlet, if you can't link to it, these trolls don't think it exists. If you can't link to it, it doesn't exist. That means if you just produce your artwork in print form, you're totally outside the radar.
Yes.
They're not looking at you because it doesn't matter. If it's not in electronic form, it doesn't exist. You can get away with anything you want in print. So this ties into Marshall McLuhan, who Marshall McLuhan was one of the few people who wrote Understanding Media and the Laws of Media, one of the few people who understood what the effects of the electronic age would have on human consciousness. McLuhan's, one of the laws of media that he created was, he said, any technology, when pushed to its extreme, flips into its opposite function. So the internet, when it first appeared in the 90s, it was the Wild West. This was the answer to getting around the gatekeepers. You can do whatever you want on the internet. There's no one stopping you. Now everyone stops you. As I said, if you post the wrong thing on Facebook, you're fired. So the true freedom, everything, it flips into its opposite function. What was originally the ultimate avatar of freedom has now flipped into its opposite. And so now you have more freedom in print. So what you have to do is you just have to look around. And as William S. Burroughs said in Nova Express, the general orders under emergency conditions is to look around and see what everyone else is doing and don't do it.
Exactly.
So there's actually windows of opportunity here for people, but you just have to look where no one else is looking and then occupy that space before everyone finds out about it.
I'm a big fan in my art of doing, I like really fast, and I still like analog, but I mix them. So like the music videos I make, they're really fast. The all of it. I don't overthink. Nothing's overthought. And having done films in the past where everything was overthought and it would take forever to do one film, I can get like 70 little gonzo films done. And
Right.
and I like the idea what you're talking about. Like you can call it enantiodramia when you push one going to an extreme all the way you click back and you're at the other end. That's always spoken to me in a very deeply psychological, in a symbolic way within my psyche. Like that, makes a lot of sense to me. It's like an internal ticker, and if you overlay that with stuff in the creative realm, there's a lot of juice to be had there. This is
Well, that's the reconciliation of opposites. That was one of the ultimate goals of the alchemists, was to reconcile opposites, and that's where you have those the alchemical symbols of like the green dragon or the androgynous dragon, or the hermaphrodite in alchemy, the cosmic he-she. That was the goal, to reconcile the opposites, a polarity. That's what that's a symbol in Masonry. You enter the lodge and there's two poles.
Yes.
There's two poles. And so reconciling opposites is embedded in these ancient hermetic rituals.
Yeah, this goes way back in. It's like it seems it's all over in mythos. I'm wondering. Oh man, I can't believe it's 8 already.
I want to say something. You were talking about alchemy, and I was thinking the whole time you're talking about Jack Kirby is that a lot of the comic book character origin stories are alchemical in nature.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I go into that in I go into that in my essay about the Hulk.
Absolutely.
He's turned into the Hulk by the G-bomb.
Yeah, right. Right.
I mean,
so good.
you can't really get more blatant than that.
No. It's so good.
And I don't know if you've seen any of the DC comic shows that CW's made lately. The Cringeworthy Network. I don't know. The CW, whatever CW stands for. But like The Flash, sorry.
Oh, The Flash. Well, yes. Well, of course, the Flash in the comic books, the Flash is turned into the Flash through a chemical experiment, lightning hitting the chemicals. Yes. And Grant Morrison, who's a comic book writer, who's very well aware of all this and uses the symbolism on purpose in his comic books. He wrote a great book called Super Gods, where he analyzes these classic comic book figures through a kind of Kabbalistic lens. And he mentions the fact that each of the respective ages of comic books, people who are into comic books talk about the Golden Age. There's the Silver Age. So the Golden Age started in the 40s. The Silver Age started at the beginning of the 60s. And then there's the Bronze Age, which starts like in the early 70s. And then the Dark Age, that Alan Moore and Frank Miller brought in the 80s. And Grant Morrison points out how each of the characters that triggers these respective ages, which obviously was decided after the fact, people decided, that's where the age begins, that's where it ends. It's obvious in retrospect, right? No one decided that at the time. But Grant Morrison said each of these ages is brought about by the Kabbalistic thunderstrike. Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel, Shazam. They call him Shazam now.
Right, DC,
he was called Captain Marvel. The symbol on his chest is the thunderstrike. Then in the Silver Age, it begins with the Flash. Julius Schwartz, Julius Schwartz, who was Lovecraft's literary agent, then went to work for DC and revamped all the DC superheroes. And the first one he revamped was the Flash.
Threw a sprinkle of Mercury in there too, to go with the lightning.
There you go. And then the Flash has that bolt of lightning on his chest. And then the Bronze Age, you have Jim Starlin's work on Warlock, Adam Warlock. and Warlock, the symbol on his chest is the lightning bolt. And then you have the beginning of the Dark Age, which is Alan Moore's Miracle Man, number one, which precedes Watchmen, precedes Dark Knight, and Miracle Man, which is a takeoff on Shazam or Captain Marvel. He too has that lightning symbol on his chest. So each of these respective ages is brought about by that Kabbalistic thunderstrike. Fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like it was planned.
Well, no, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, that's another.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
I look at it as a pattern that's playing out, not so much as a plan, but a pattern.
Absolutely, I would agree with you.
There would be magic there.
Well, there's something.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Not intentional, but the magic of the synchronistic aspect.
Absolutely.
Of it.
Oh, also, Chris Knowles has written a book. Was it The Gods Wear Spandex? Something like that, about comic books and esoterica. I'm looking it up.
Did we get any questions from the chat at all?
No, not that I saw. Our gods wear spandex.
Yes, I do. In fact, you know what? I might have quoted from that in the article that I wrote about the Hulk. There's been a number of books recently that sort of hit that theme, and Grant Morrison has had his own. There's a fascinating documentary, you can see it on YouTube, called Grant Morrison Talking with Gods, where he talks about purposely peppering, using magic himself to create some of the comic books. So you go from an age where people were doing it unconsciously to some extent. I think in Kirby's case, you can argue that much of it was in fact conscious, and then moving forward to where people like Grant Morrison and Alan Moore actually claim to be ceremonial magicians and use the magic on purpose to create the storylines and the characters from which the comic books are emerging.
Well, you've heard Morrison's DEF CON story about the Invisibles, right?
Was this about the trip to the mountaintop?
Yeah, that was part of it, and then how the Invisibles, as he was working on it, started to come alive in his life, and he realized he was creating a sigil, a hyper sigil. Yes,
absolutely. Yes, that is fascinating. The Invisibles is I consider that his masterpiece, a fantastic comic book, and I highly recommend it.
All right. I do have a question now.
Yes.
From the Peanut Gallery. Ask Robert, have you found that joining the Masons helped you gain clarity in regards to your mastery over your symbolic language? Or was the main benefit of the brotherhood aspect?
I would say that it's kind of like I told you the story about the dream. And I saw the Masonic Research Center, and it was filled with all these crazy books and all this weirdness, And then I actually got there, and it was just this like one raggedy little bookshelf, with nothing on it.
Have you visited any other large libraries since then?
I have. In fact, I served as the assistant librarian at the Scottish Rite Library, which was much more extensive. In fact, had an original. I held it in my hands. I looked through it. An original edition of Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages, before it had that title, the longer title, and in a gigantic wooden slipcase.
Oh my God!
Larger than any Toshin book I've ever seen, and an amazing, beautiful artifact. And in fact, books
are porn to me. That is, oh my God.
Oh yeah, it was amazing, and so I had free. What this is okay. Let me make the first point, and then I'll go back. The first point is when I saw that bookshelf and it filled with and I realized that my bookshelf at home was better. You might think, oh well, that's like a disappointing, punchline. You're just sitting there with ash in your hands, But in fact, if you have the right eyes to see, that pile of ash is actually filled with much illumination and magic, and that's why I think much of this is self-initiation, because That's why you're not supposed to approach people and say, "Would you like to be a Mason?"
Yeah.
They have to come. They have to come themselves. And when I tell people, it's some people criticize Manly P. Hall, like actual scholars, and they'll say, "Manly P. Hall, where's his footnotes? Where are the endnotes? Like he quotes these people, and where's the original source?" He's not really a legitimate scholar, is what they'll say. And what I think is that was actually part of Manly P. Hall's entire purpose. I'm not going to include endnotes. I'm not going to include footnotes. I'm not going to tell you where the original source is. You have to go find it yourself.
Yes, absolutely.
And so when I went to the Scottish Rite, because I was working on an article for New Dawn, and I wanted to access to their library, because they in fact did have old Masonic articles way back, and books. And but the librarian, the guy who was the librarian, you could only go in when he was physically there. The rule was that you could only go in when there was a librarian there. And I said to the guy, "Well, I need more than just like an hour. I need. You can't take the books out, so you have to be there." And he goes, "Well, I can't be here." He goes, "You seem like a bright guy. How about you be the assistant librarian? Then you can be here by yourself."
Excellent.
And I go, "Okay, that's good." And so I was officially the assistant librarian. So then I would go there every morning, like at 8, and get there, and I'd open the door. I had the keys. I was the holder of the keys now, and I would open the door, and then I was there, and I would do all my research, which eventually evolved into one of the chapters that's in CRYPTOSCATOLOGY. So people would come wander in, and the library's open. It was like a rare occasion. They'd come in, I can look at the books. And this old man came in who was probably in his late 80s, and he was there with his son, I think, who was like in his 30s or older. And the old man said, it's fantastic to see the library open. And I had a Manly P. Hall book sitting there, and he goes, "Oh, Manly P. Hall, I met him."
Oh my God.
And I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah, Manly P. Hall came and lectured here in the ritual room." And he said it was like 1970 something. And Mr. Hall went up onto the stage, and he delivered a 3-hour lecture on the symbolism of the cross with no notes.
Oh my God, I love it.
no notes, entirely off the top of his head.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I would sit there, and people would come in, and then I'd strike up conversations with like these old Masons coming in, and then I would go back to the research, and I did that for several weeks, on a daily basis.
That's wonderful. I love that. What a treasure in the end.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That's all the questions that I've got. I think you done this. Did you get all your answers?
Yeah, yes.
All
This has
right.
been a great pleasure, Robert.
Yes, thank you so much.
I feel like we need more.
I think we need to do an obelisk on comic book
Yes.
symbolism or comic
Yes.
book esoterica.
That would be fantastic. Yes, absolutely.
We have another show that we're starting next month called The Obelisk, and we're just going to go deep dive on subjects. So maybe we'll have you back
I
sometime.
And take calls and take phone calls.
Yes.
I see. So this one will be specifically about dreams.
Yes.
And then the other one, the obelisk, will be about a whole multiplicity of different subjects.
A silo
Yes.
of topic. Silo
Well,
topic.
I see.
And we found these our dream shows, they, as you could tell tonight, and with past ones too, they meander in their own way, and they have, each episode has a life of its own, according to the guest, of course. And so I think it's just a good bridge from here to there to just.
Yes, I would love Alan Greenfield. He spent maybe like 5 minutes talking about working for Illuminate Press in the 90s. I'd love to hear an hour on that.
Yes. Oh.
About Ron Bonds and Jim Keith and all those guys. Illuminate Press was fantastic. I had probably almost all their books before Ron Bonds sadly died.
We're planning a show with Alan and was it John Tenney and Greg Newkirk, 3 of them, to do like a past, present, and future ufology.
Oh, great.
Roundtable
Yeah,
kind
that's
of thing.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm writing this down though with this idea with Illuminate Press and Ellen, just so I have it here on my diary because I love that idea too, Robert.
Yeah, there's so many. We're open to exploring anything, you know, as long as we have a guest to talk about it. So
well, thank you.
I would love to hear Alan Greenfield talking about the golden age of ufology, a subject that I'm much interested in and inspired my second book, Spies and Saucers. Those three novellas were very much grew out of me freebasing the 1950s contactee books.
You should reach out to him. He'll talk to you. He loves to talk.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to. The Secret Cipher, the UFOnauts, in fact, inspired a short story that I recently finished writing and is being read right now by an editor. But reading that book inspired this particular short story. So
excellent. That's great.
You might be interested in hearing about that.
I'm sure he would. And if you send him $50, he'll be your friend. So
he is a legend. And also, I guess where can people find you and all that?
Yes. Plug your stuff, dude.
Okay, so all the books are available on Amazon, CHAMELEO, Spies and Saucers, CRYPTOSCATOLOGY, Bela Lugosi and the Monogram 9, until the Last Dog Dies, which is a novel about a humor virus that it doesn't kill you, but it just destroys the humor center of the brain. And it goes pandemic, and it's told from the point of view of a stand-up comedian in Los Angeles. And midway through the book, he comes down with the humor virus, and he starts losing a sense of humor. So it's a parable for our times, I think. And all of those are available on Amazon, and my website is CRYPTOSCATOLOGY.com.
And all these links are in the show description.
Excellent. Most excellent.
And the show notes on the podcast. Great. Well, that's all I got. So thank you again, Robert. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
And hope to talk to you again sometime.
Come on to the obelisk. We definitely.
I would love to do that. Yes, absolutely. This has been very fun.
Right. Yes, it's been a blast. Thanks so much. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And be sure to tune in next week when we have special guest Jordan Maxwell. So that should be a trip.
Already.
Yep.
Wow.
So thanks, everyone, and take care and have a great night.
Good night, everyone.